Sometimes you just really need answers. Imagine you're sitting on your couch. You're watching a man standing behind a podium in the White House press room. It looks like a standard news segment, except you've been prompted to call in, and the man on the screen is talking directly to you. Because he was nearby and looked the part, he was wearing a suit, he's been chosen as the representative for a newly formed group of hive-minded non-individuals to explain the apocalyptic conditions that broke out about an hour ago. Right after you notice those heavy contrails streaking across the New Mexico sky. He's there to help. He'll do whatever it takes to make you understand. There's just one weird detail. Everything he says is coming from an unspecified we. And when you ask him who that is, he gives the helpful clarification, we is us, just us. How did everyone on Earth go from 8 billion individuals to one collective us in an afternoon? Vince Gilligan's new show Pluribus does a pretty good job of explaining the broad strokes of that in its first 2 episodes. But if you're like me and don't have a background in theoretical biology, you might have found yourself sitting on your couch bewildered like Carol. You don't have the Undersecretary of Agriculture and Farm Production and Conservation and his helpful chyrons emphasizing key points like, we are not aliens. So you're left doing what I did, freeze framing the whiteboard from the research lab, looking up terms like lysogenic cycle or searching nucleotide sequence on Reddit, trying to process a bunch of unconnected science you'll never fully understand and really don't need to understand to enjoy the show. It's not the worst way to spend an afternoon or, a whole day, and maybe that might be how you ended up here. The good news is you don't have to go down that path. I say this as someone who voluntarily lived in that rabbit hole for more than a week. Here is the short version of what you hopefully picked up. Astronomers found a signal. It contained a recipe for an RNA sequence. Humans, being humans, decided to cook that recipe. It created a virus. A researcher got bitten by a rat, then felt compelled to infect others via kissing and donut licking. The infected coordinated, spread it globally, and triggered the joining. A global seizure that rebooted humanity into a hive mind. Everyone is happy. Everyone is connected. Everyone except for a handful of seemingly unconnected people who are immune for unknown reasons. That combined with a very helpful metaphor that the virus works as a psychic glue, connecting everyone, is technically all you need to know. And I mean it. If you want the joining explained, that's it. And there's a reason for that. Pluribus isn't trying to be hard sci-fi. It's not The Expanse. Vince Gilligan has explicitly stated he wanted to create an anti-zombie story. In The Walking Dead, the horror is that your neighbor wants to eat you. In Pluribus, the horror is that your neighbor wants to help you. To make that work, the science only had to be semi-plausible. It just needs to be real enough to get us to the character drama. The virus doesn't need to be biologically perfect. It just needs to be a clever delivery mechanism for the show's central question. Is humanity meant to fight for the right to be miserable on its own terms? But we are humans. Nerdy ones at that. What are the chances we won't take a closer look? Having a shaky grasp of the science doesn't change where we're going, but it might make the ride more interesting. So, for those of you who do want to know exactly how the world ended, not metaphorically, but mechanically, I've gone through the freeze frames and the notes so you don't have to. But let's be clear. I am not a scientist. I'm just a guy who watches TV and has Google. So while I'm going to present this information with the unearned confidence anyone with a mid-sized YouTube audience has, please remember that my qualifications come from rewatching, not biology. I guess what I'm saying is no one needs to get all Carol about it. But if you are scientifically inclined, feel free to share any additional information in the comments. Now let's look at the architecture of the assimilation. The narrative doesn't actually start with Carol in the bar. It starts 439 days earlier, in the silence of space. The signal that started it all originated from a star system 600 light years away. Now the distance here is actually a great detail. If that signal traveled at the speed of light, it was sent 600 years ago. That means the aliens who sent it didn't know about iPhones or nuclear weapons or Breaking Bad. They sent it during our 15th century. It was a seed broadcast into the void, waiting for a civilization advanced enough to build a radio telescope, but foolish enough to build what the signal told them to. And it wasn't just noise, it repeated every 78 seconds, a clear sign of artificial origin, and it wasn't binary code. The scientists at the very large array threw out the term quaternary. Binary uses 2 digits, 0 and 1. Quaternary is base 4. And when the astronomer who discovered it realized they wouldn't put that much effort into sending it only to make it hard to understand, he realized what it was. The scientists realized the 4 tones didn't represent numbers. They represented biological building blocks: guanine, uracil, adenine, and cytosine, GUAC. The aliens didn't send a message saying hello. They sent a zip file with the makings of a biological agent. Think of an exe file attachment that shows up in your email box that you know you definitely, under no circumstances, should ever click. By transmitting the sequence for a specific RNA strand, they effectively teleported a virus across the galaxy. Something akin to information panspermia, which is a fancy way of saying they emailed us a ticking bomb. And when it comes to something like that, humanity always be clicking. Fun fact, this opening sequence was shot at the Very Large Array, which is basically located in the middle of nowhere in the New Mexico desert and part of the National Radio Astronomy Observatory. The dishes you see the pickup truck race past aren't optical telescopes that see visible light. Instead, they see the universe in the radio part of the electromagnetic spectrum. The Very Large Array name is literal. It consists of 27 individual radio antennas that are arranged in a giant Y pattern on railroad tracks, allowing them to be moved to different configurations. By combining the signals, the VLA acts as a single gigantic telescope with a resolution far greater than any single dish could achieve. This allows it to study things like the birth and death of stars, supermassive black holes, galactic nuclei, pulsars, and all sorts of other cool-sounding things. The Very Large Array is also famous in popular culture as the setting for the film Contact, based on the novel by Carl Sagan. In Pluribus, a scene where we see astronomers gathering to discuss the signal, the show hired real scientists who worked there to do the cameos. USAMRIID, the United States Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, another real-world location where some real scientists were hired for the montage, synthesized this molecule, proving once again that curiosity is one of humanity's greatest vulnerabilities. They printed the virus from the alien blueprint, assuming a biosafety level 4 facility could hold it. Spoiler alert, it couldn't. The breach didn't happen with an explosion. It happened because of a rat. About 42 days before the world ended, a test subject, a simple lab rat, did something rats aren't supposed to do. It appeared to die. Now, there is a popular theory online that this was a Trojan rat, that the virus gave the animal the intelligence to fake its own death, specifically to lure the researcher into opening the cage, which would make the virus seem deviously smart, but personally, that wasn't my interpretation. It's a fun idea, but we never get confirmation from the showrunners that the rat was acting. What we do see later is that when the virus fully activates in humans, it causes a massive seizure. It seems far more likely that the rat wasn't playing dead, it was seizing. It was in the middle of its own joining. When the researcher reached in, she just happened to interrupt the process, and the rat reacted by following its new biological imperative. It bit her, it infected her. Whether it was a master plan or just bad timing, the result was the same. The virus found its target host. Once inside, it acts as a lysogenic virus. Unlike something like Ebola, which destroys cells to replicate, a lysogenic virus integrates into the host genome. It becomes part of you. That's why the researchers didn't get sick. They just got a happy new outlook. The transmission vector was saliva, but the show avoids the usual zombie stuff here. The infected don't get all bitey. They kiss you, they swap spit, they lick donuts, and they execute these actions joyfully. It reframes infection as an act of intimacy. The infected aren't mindless in the traditional sense. They're hyper-efficient. The synchronization phase we saw in the lab, where the staff moved in eerie unison, proves that the psychic glue connects them immediately. They became working parts of a biological supermachine, executing a plan to cultivate and seed the virus while preparing for phase 2. As Zosha explains to Carol in the second episode, they'd been peacefully bringing in thousands of new individuals daily for over a month until the military discovered them. Then, to avoid even more bloodshed, they had to accelerate the process. The culmination of the peaceful, silent spread wasn't gradual. It was an instantaneous global event. From what we see on screen, they moved from saliva to aerosol transmission. When Carol sees the weirdly uniform contrails from planes in the sky outside the bar, they actually are chemtrails delivering the virus at a global scale. As the countdown clock that framed the events of the first episode of the series hit zero, the joining is all but complete, and Carol's wife Helen becomes an early casualty. In the bar scene with Carol, every patron gets infected at the exact same moment. When they fall, it isn't just a fainting spell. It's a neurological reboot. The seizure represents the moment of bootstrapping, where individual consciousness is overwritten or merged into the collective. The physical convulsion is likely the result of the body's hardware reacting to the new software installation. This loss of individual control mirrors the societal shift that's happening, and that the show will continue to explore. Unlike a normal seizure that leaves you confused and groggy, the survivors of the joining stand up with immediate clarity. They aren't disoriented, they're repurposed. They recognize each other instantly because they're no longer strangers, they're us. But while the hive mind claims to be benevolent, the transition has a cost, a massive one. The show establishes a grim statistic which is hard to overlook. Approximately 886 million people died during the joining. That's nearly a billion people, or 11% of the world's total population snuffed out in an instant. These deaths weren't caused by a bad reaction from the virus being toxic. They were collateral damage. People seized while driving on the highway. Surgeons seized in the middle of operations. People were riding bicycles, operating heavy machinery. You get the idea. The mechanism of death was the incapacitation itself. You could call them changeover casualties if you want to view global tragedy through a bureaucratic lens, or you could be more cynical like Carol pointed out. Well, you gotta break some eggs. The hive might opt for metaphysical comforts, claiming the consciousness of those who died during the event was uploaded to the collective before biological death, which we did see with Helen. Still, for survivors like Carol, it's just loss on an unimaginable scale, and the ends don't justify the means. This event draws a sharp line in the sand. Before the joining, humanity was a mess of competing individuals. After the joining, the world is efficient, peaceful, and unified. Crime is gone, war is over, but the cost is the death of nearly a billion people and the erasure of free will for everyone else. A nice apocalypse, sure, but it's still an apocalypse, and one that no one willingly signed up for. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, wait a minute, is any of this biologically possible, scientifically sound, you're not alone. The show's subreddit was flooded with actual scientists weighing in on the premise, and surprisingly, they weren't tearing it apart. This is where the show's commitment to technical anchors really pays off. The writers clearly did their homework, or at least hired people who did. They brought in science advisors, including real-world virologists, to make sure the procedures were realistic, even if the alien tech was pure magic. It's a technique Gilligan used throughout Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. If you watch someone who looks like they know what they're doing do something, it creates a sense of legitimacy. One Reddit user claiming to have a PhD in virology pointed out that while the transition from a radio signal to a biological virus was abrupt, the show absolutely nailed the hubris of the researchers. They pointed towards the accurate depiction of the BSL-4 safety breaches, like the failure of the buddy system, as realistic human error. It turns out even when we're dealing with alien code, we still behave like humans. Another user identifying as a radio astronomer said they literally screamed at the screen during the opening sequence because the depiction of the signal detection felt so authentic. It seems the show got the texture of the science right, even if the message is pure fantasy at this point. The scientists also praised the writers for using uracil instead of thymine, guac instead of G-Tech. That correctly identifies the virus as RNA-based rather than DNA-based. It's a small blink and you'll miss it detail that meant nothing to me on first watch, but it apparently earned massive credibility points with the people who actually know what they're looking at. There is one thing scientists couldn't explain away, and that's the speed. A virus rewriting a host behavior in minutes or causing a synchronized global seizure is biologically impossible. Apparently, pathogens need time to replicate. There are also a lot of unanswered questions about how the civilization that created the virus were able to tailor it for our population, things the show isn't guaranteed to ever answer. But this is where the idea of using a strategy of ambiguity makes sense. Writer Gordon Smith has stated that explaining the exact mechanics of the hive mind, how thoughts travel between bodies without latency, would render the show meaningless. Is it quantum entanglement? Is it telepathy? The writers aren't telling, and honestly, they don't need to. They've deliberately left the mechanism as a black box. By refusing to turn the show into a technical manual, or if we're talking about boxes, a mystery box that's meant to be solved, they keep the focus exactly where it belongs, on the character drama. Because once we knew exactly how everything worked, the wonder would be gone. The others appear to have built a perfect world by erasing the friction of individuality. But that kind of perfection feels unnatural. I mean, it is literally unnatural. At least on the Earth that we know, and even the most advanced systems have bugs. For an organism that's designed for total synchronization, deviations and anomalies are a big deal. Out of the billions of people who remain after the joining, we only know of 13 who are immune by the end of the show's 2-part premiere. That's a number that's so staggeringly small that it feels like it borders on magic too. When the Hive first explains what's going on to Carol, they admit they don't know why. They just say they're dedicated to figuring out why she's different so they can fix it, so that she and the other 12 unjoined can join them. After losing Helen, Carol is uniquely placed as an adversary for universal harmony. She isn't a soldier or a scientist. She's a cynical, heavy-drinking romance novelist who calls her own work mindless crap. At the same time, she doesn't seem just like the kind of person who is miserable with their situation. She seems like she might be borderline incapable of experiencing happiness at all. In a world of non-consensual and forced happiness, her refusal to give up the things that make her her, to not smooth the rough edges of personality for the sake of social harmony, make her relatable. This is where Pluribus really starts to click. It takes a high-concept sci-fi premise and boils it down to a character study. The joining isn't just about virally induced biological transmutation, if that's even the right term, or alien technology. It's about how a truly human character responds to something like the joining after it happens. And it all might seem a little too lopsided in the collective mind's favor, but the show got ahead of that. Carol isn't just a grumpy, privileged, but also kind of relatable, reluctant hero. She's also packing some heat. When she exhibits extreme negative emotions and unloads her rage or grief on them, it triggers a physical reaction from the Hive. It causes them to seize up or glitch out, much like what happened to humanity during the joining. It's painful for them, and that's just the beginning of the costs. We know that one of her outbursts killed 11 million of them, so yeah, it balances things out. They are forced to handle Carol with extreme care, but the cost isn't any easier to overlook, even if you think they're no longer human. And as much as it dictates how they interact, they've made it plain that their biological directive means that they're working overtime trying to figure out how to bypass the immunity and assimilate the 13 unjoined. So the show doesn't succeed because its science is accurate, but because the philosophical questions that arise from the world it's reshaped can be profound, or even more than that, just a lot of fun to think about. The mechanics of the signal and the virus are necessary details that provide enough support to carry the weight of the psychological conflict. By focusing on the details of the how of the way the virus spreads, the donuts, the kissing, the synchrony, the 4-tone code, the show merges the magical elements with the mundane, making the leap you have to make to accept a global hive mind manageable and to make it feel earned. Is suffering worth saving? Are members of the Hive still human if the self has been erased? These are the types of questions the show wants us to wrestle with. Giving up control for the greater good, the value of autonomy. The real story is about what would happen if we were forced to decide, and I think that's a great place to leave things. Please like this video if you enjoyed it, please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.